There's a moment in every empath's healing journey when something shifts so fundamentally that everyone around them panics. The empath stops crying over relationships that hurt them. They stop explaining themselves to people who never understood. They stop lighting themselves on fire to keep others warm. And the people who benefited from the old version interpret this as the empath becoming cold, damaged, or broken. But Carl Jung discovered this wasn't damage at all. It was the final phase of healing. And it's the most psychologically healthy thing an empath can do. Jung spent decades studying what he called the individuation process, the journey toward becoming psychologically whole. What he found was that empaths who never complete this final phase of detachment remain trapped in patterns that slowly destroy them. They heal partially, set some boundaries, make some progress, but they never fully release the emotional entanglement that keeps them hooked into dynamics that harm them. Today I'm going to show you what Jung discovered about the final detachment phase, why it looks like coldness but is actually consciousness, and how this stage of healing transforms the empath into someone who can finally protect their own peace without guilt or apology. Carl Jung observed something in his practice that made him question everything he thought he knew about empathy and healing. His most empathic patients would make progress in therapy. They'd recognize their patterns, understand their wounds, develop better boundaries. But they'd still be emotionally devastated every time certain people disappointed them. They knew intellectually that these relationships were toxic, but emotionally, they remained completely attached. Then one day, something would change. The patient would come in and talk about the same person who usually triggered intense emotion. But the charge would be gone, not suppressed, not bypassed, just genuinely absent. Jung realized he was witnessing something profound, the final cutting of an emotional cord that had been draining the empath's life force for years. What distinguished this detachment from the earlier stages of healing was its completeness. These empaths weren't white-knuckling their way through interactions. They weren't using coping mechanisms to manage their reactivity. They had reached a state of genuine internal neutrality, where the other person's behavior simply no longer affected them emotionally. Jung called this psychological sovereignty. The empath had finally reclaimed the energy they had been unconsciously sending toward people who would never reciprocate. And in reclaiming that energy, they became whole in a way they'd never been before. To understand why this final detachment is so crucial, you need to see what Jung saw when he looked at partially healed empaths. They had done significant work. They understood their trauma. They could articulate their boundaries. They knew what healthy relationships looked like, but they were still emotionally invested in outcomes involving people who had proven themselves incapable of meeting them halfway. This investment showed up in subtle ways. They'd say they didn't care, but they'd still check the person's social media. They'd claim they were over it, but they'd still feel a surge of anxiety when that person's name came up. They'd insist they'd moved on, but they'd still secretly hope the person would finally see their worth and come back differently. Jung recognized this as a form of psychological bondage. The empath's consciousness had evolved, but their emotional body was still attached to the old dynamic. They were living in two realities simultaneously: the reality they understood intellectually and the reality they felt emotionally. And that split was exhausting them. The final detachment happens when these two realities finally align. When what the empath knows in their mind becomes what they feel in their body. When the understanding that someone is toxic translates into genuine disinterest in having any connection with them. when the knowledge that they deserve better becomes an unshakable internal certainty that no longer seeks external validation. But here's what makes this phase so difficult and so misunderstood. The detachment doesn't happen through more understanding or more boundary work. It happens through grief. Real, bone-deep grief for what never was and will never be. Jung found that empaths often skip this grief because it feels like going backward. They have already processed so much pain. They don't want to return to it. But the final detachment requires mourning, not just what happened, but all the hope they carried about what could have happened, all the fantasies about the person finally changing, all the belief that if they just loved hard enough, gave enough chances, explained themselves clearly enough, the other person would finally see them. This grief is different from earlier stages of pain. It's not dramatic or intense. It's a quiet, profound sadness for the years spent investing in something that was always one-sided, for the energy poured into people who were never going to reciprocate, for the hope that sustained them through repeated disappointment. Think about someone who spent 20 years believing their parent would eventually become capable of emotional support, who gave chance after chance, adjusted their expectations lower and lower, told themselves maybe this time would be different. The final detachment requires grieving not just the parent they didn't have, but the dream of ever having that parent. And that grief is devastating because it means accepting that some things will never be different, no matter how much you want them to be. Jung observed that this grief process cannot be rushed. Some empaths need weeks, some need months, some cycle through it multiple times before it finally completes. But what emerges on the other side is remarkable. An empath who has genuinely let go of emotional investment in outcomes involving people who hurt them. This letting go manifests in specific observable ways that Jung documented in his patients. The detached empath stops explaining themselves, not out of resentment, but because they've realized that people who are determined to misunderstand them will find a way to do so, no matter how clearly they communicate. They stop defending their choices, not because they don't stand behind those choices, but because they've recognized that people who need to justify their own dysfunction by attacking your boundaries will never be satisfied with any explanation you give. They stop hoping for reconciliation, not because they're bitter, but because they've accepted that reconciliation requires two people committed to genuine change, and the other party has proven through consistent action that they're not one of those people. What makes this detachment look like coldness to outside observers is its completeness. The detached empath doesn't have occasional moments of weakness where they reach out. They don't get triggered back into the drama. They don't engage with flying monkeys or respond to hoovering attempts. They've built an internal firewall so strong that nothing gets through. But Jung emphasized that this isn't coldness, it's clarity. The empath has finally stopped confusing their hope for reality. They're seeing people as they actually are, not as who they could be with the right support, understanding, or love. And when you see clearly, detachment becomes the only sane response. Here's where Jung's framework becomes crucial for understanding why this detachment is healing rather than harm. Jung believed that psychological health required the integration of all parts of the self, including the parts we've been taught to reject as unacceptable. For empaths, one of those rejected parts is the capacity for detachment. They've been socialized to believe that caring deeply about everyone is virtue, that maintaining connection at all costs is loyalty, that giving endless chances is love. To detach is to fail at being empathic. To protect your own peace is to be selfish. But Jung saw through this cultural programming. He recognized that the inability to detach isn't compassion, it's codependency. That the refusal to let go isn't love, it's fear. That the maintenance of toxic connections isn't loyalty, it's self-betrayal. The final detachment is the empath integrating the shadow side of their empathy, the fierce protective energy that says no more and means it, the part that can witness suffering without feeling compelled to fix it, the part that can love from a distance without needing proximity or reconciliation. Jung found that empaths who successfully integrate